Google has a tremendous influence on the internet. Its search engine handles more than 3 billion searches a day. It is the most widely used search engine in the world and has a 64% market share in the United States. It leaves competitors Bing and DuckDuckGo in the dust. In 2015, the company was worth almost $75 billion. Google has infiltrated our daily routines with its products and services, including smartphones, tablets, laptops, and even financial organization solutions. It has a large impact on culture. It also has a huge influence on the news we read. The Pew Research Center reports that 62% of U.S. adults get their news on social media, primarily from Facebook, which passed Google as the biggest referrer of internet traffic to news sites last year. In February, Google announced it will use its tremendous reach to influence politics. Eric Schmidt, Google's CEO, said Google Ideas would be transformed into a technology incubator called Jigsaw. Google Ideas was the tech giant's think tank. Schmidt said, "The team's mission is to use technology to tackle the toughest geopolitical challenges, from countering violent extremism to thwarting online censorship to mitigating the threats associated with digital attacks." Jigsaw will deploy its conversation AI, software designed to block what Google considers harmful statements online. The software uses machine learning to automatically locate language that the corporation deems abusive and will give it an attack score. The technology will be tested out in the contents section of the New York Times, and Wikipedia also plans on using it, according to Wired. The Jigsaw algorithm will search through 17 million comments at the New York Times and find those flagged as offensive or inappropriate by moderators. In other words, one of the largest establishment newspapers in the world will teach Jigsaw what is politically correct, and the software will be deployed by Google to rank content on the internet. Google's Jigsaw teamed up with Moonshot CVE, a London startup dedicated to what it calls counter-messaging campaigns in response to violent extremism online. The project redirects suspected jihadis and their supporters to a YouTube channel with anti-ISIS propaganda videos. It's an idea approved by the U.S. government. During an event at the Brookings Institute, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs Richard Stengel said he thought the idea is a promising method for dealing with radical jihadis online. But jihadis are not the only target. Moonshot's co-founder, Ross Frennett, says his company takes money from the Gen Next Foundation and plans to target other so-called extremists on the right. Frennett said during Phase 2 of the Moonshot and Jigsaw project, they will focus on violence in America. He said right-wing extremists in America are more brazen online than what he calls ISIS fanboys. What is the Gen Next Foundation? It calls itself a leading-edge global organization addressing the root causes of violent extremism. On its website, it mentions the terror attacks of 9/11, the Boston Marathon, Charlie Hebdo, Paris, and San Bernardino. It features Google's Jigsaw logo. It also hosts programs with government insiders like the former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and the Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano. Google's Jigsaw is headed up by Jared Cohen. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in counter-radicalization, with a focus on terrorism, radicalization, the impact of connected technologies on 21st century statecraft, and Iran. He served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as an advisor to Condoleezza Rice and later Hillary Clinton. During his tenure at Google Ideas, Cohen and Google CEO Schmidt wrote a policy paper for the CFR's House organ, Foreign Affairs. The paper praises the reformative potential of Silicon Valley technologies as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. It advocates coalitions of the connected and uses military metaphors. Cohen and Schmidt believe it's their duty to protect citizens around the world. WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange characterizes Cohen as Google's director of regime change. Writing for Newsweek, Assange said Cohen's goal is the cross-fertilization of influence between elites and their vassals under the pious rubric of civil society. The received wisdom in advanced capitalist societies is that there still exists an organic, quote-unquote, civil society sector in which institutions come together to manifest the interests and will of citizens. The fable has it that the boundaries of this sector are respected by actors from government and the private sector, leaving a safe space for NGOs and nonprofits to advocate for things like human rights, free speech, and accountable government. This, of course, is an illusion. Large institutions, government, corporations, and their vetted NGOs don't come together for the sake of civil society. Cohen worked for the Council on Foreign Relations, a globalist organization established in 1921 by the British Roundtable groups and controlled in America by J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller, and Whitney families. The historian and Georgetown University professor Carol Quigley writes, "The CFR is the American version of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as the Chatham House, a secretive seminar held by the global elite. The global elite and their partners, including Google's Eric Schmidt, understand that certain ideologies pose a threat to their control of the international order. The Islamic State does not pose a direct threat outside of the Middle East, although much is made of its radicalization process and isolated, unconnected terror events, primarily in Europe, but also in the United States." The real threat? The so-called American right. Addressing that threat is the purpose of Jigsaw. In April of 2009, a document was leaked from the Department of Homeland Security. It was entitled Right-Wing Extremism, Current Economic and Political Climate Fueling Resurgence in Radicalization and Recruitment.
America. The threat comes from what it calls right-wing extremists in this country. The report says people who are opposed to restricting Second Amendment rights to bear arms or who are concerned about illegal immigration and border security could well fall under the Department of Homeland Security definition of an extremist.
Work on the white paper began during the Bush administration. It was completed under Obama's DHS Secretary, Janet Napolitano. The paper didn't name al-Qaeda or jihadi groups as the primary threat to the homeland. Instead, it focused on political groups and individuals the government identified as right-wing. The DHS said that lone wolves and small terrorist cells embracing violent, right-wing extremist ideology are the most dangerous domestic terrorism threat in the United States. The authors of the report made this claim despite stating in the key findings section of the document that the DHS and Office of Intelligence and Analysis had no specific information domestic right-wing terrorists were planning acts of violence. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the Department of Homeland Security work together. They share information, define best practices, and conduct training seminars. The center's Rage on the Right, the Year in Hate and Extremism, lists a number of groups, including the Constitution Party, Oath Keepers, We Are Change, and the John Birch Society.
The spate of real terrorist incidents that we've seen since Obama's election are quite remarkable. And of course, this was the very kind of activity that was talked about in the infamous Department of Homeland Security report that was so pilloried by Republicans and others on the right. As it turns out, of course, the report was really prescient. It was completely accurate.
The establishment media embrace the SPLC talking points and routinely conflate constitutionalists and other entirely legal groups with white supremacists and the Aryan Brotherhood.
And that fringe and very specific American sickness has been preserved and handed down in the centuries since they invented it in Reconstruction. It has been preserved and handed down in the centuries since by white supremacists, to the point where you can buy sovereign citizens, I don't recognize the federal government, fake legal papers to try to use in court. You can buy those fake legal papers out of the back pages of Aryan Brotherhood newsletters that circulate in the prison system.
Supporters of the Obama administration have cited the leaked Department of Homeland Security document and its SPLC-influenced conclusions as evidence their political enemies are violent. For instance, Think Progress, an organization funded by George Soros, quoted the Southern Poverty Law Center as saying the number of hate groups operating in the United States continued to rise in 2008 and had grown by 54% since 2000, mostly due to immigration fears, a failing economy, and the election of Barack Obama. State fusion centers are taking their lead from the feds. In 2009, a document was leaked from the Missouri Information Analysis Center titled The Modern Militia Movement. The report names Ron Paul, Chuck Baldwin, and Bob Barr as militia-influenced terrorists. It instructs the Missouri police to be on the lookout for supporters displaying bumper stickers and other paraphernalia associated with the Constitutional, Campaign for Liberty, and Libertarian parties. The following year, the Justice Department got in on the action. It produced a guide for investigators of criminal and extremist groups. The guide lists constitutionalists and survivalists alongside Al-Qaeda, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Communist Party. In 2015, the DOJ teamed up with the New America Foundation, a think tank chaired by Google CEO Eric Schmidt. New America is funded by the U.S. State Department, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wall Street billionaire Peter J. Peterson, Eric and Wendy Schmidt, and George Soros' Open Society Institute. George Soros' son, Jonathan, sits on the board of directors. According to Schmidt and New America, there are thousands of dangerous right-wing extremists, and they have killed more people in the United States than jihadis have. These Americans thrive on hate and conspiracy theories, writes Kurt Eichenwald for Newsweek, many fed to them by politicians and commentators who blithely blather about government concentration camps and impending martial law, and plans to seize guns and other dystopian gibberish, apparently unaware there are people listening who don't know it's all lies. These extremists turn to violence against minorities, non-Christians, abortion providers, government officials, in what they believe is a fight to save America, and that potential for violence is escalating every day. Under Secretary of State John Kerry, the State Department has escalated the violence in Syria and has worked closely with the sort of jihadi groups New America claims to oppose. The August 2015 dump of Hillary Clinton's emails reveals she also has ties to the New America Foundation. The foundation is headed up by Anne Marie Slaughter, who is a former Clinton State Department staffer. As Secretary of State, Clinton oversaw the destruction of Libya and the murder of 30,000 Libyans. The illegal wars waged against the people of Syria and Libya make a complete mockery of New America's supposed humanitarian concern about terrorism, especially alleged terrorism the Justice Department insists is committed by constitutionalists and survivalists. New America cites the Wisconsin Sikh temple shooting as a primary example of right-wing domestic terror. The 2012 attack was committed by white supremacist and Army veteran Wade Michael Page. He was a member of the Hammerskins, a neo-Nazi skinhead group. The Southern Poverty Law Center says there are over 900 white supremacist groups in America, including the White Aryan Resistance, Church of the Creator, and the Ku Klux Klan. The SPLC does not mention that the FBI not only infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan in the 1960s, but actively assisted the group. The Church Committee hearings in the 1960s and internal FBI documents reveal that more than 1/4 of all active Klan members during the period were FBI agents or informants. Bureau intelligence assets were not neutral observers nor objective investigators, but active participants in beatings, bombings, and murders that claimed the lives of some 50 civil rights activists by 1964. The degree of FBI control over white supremacists was revealed during the trial of the racist talk show host Hal Turner. He was put on trial in 2009 for threatening to kill federal judges. During the trial, it was revealed Turner worked for the FBI as an informant. When he was called to the stand, Turner described how he was recruited in 2003 by the FBI's Newark-based Joint Terrorism Task Force. He said he was paid in excess of $100,000 by the FBI during his almost 5 years as an informant. Like NATO and the CIA's Operation Gladio in Europe, the FBI's COINTELPRO was used in America to create the impression terrorists posed a threat to society. During the 1960s and early 1970s, virtually every anti-establishment political movement was infiltrated by the government, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, the American Indian Movement, Students for Democratic Society, the Lawyers Guild, the Black Panthers, and Weather Underground. The Church Committee discovered government infiltration stretched back to the First World War. According to the independent journalist Yasha Levine, during the 1968 protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which drew about 10,000 protesters and was brutally crushed by police, 1 out of 6 protesters was a federal undercover agent. More recently, COINTELPRO tactics were used to destroy the Occupy Wall Street movement. Police from New York to Oakland, California, infiltrated the movement and engaged in disruptive behavior to discredit its legal protest activities. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, the fear of terrorism has led to a new era of overzealous police intelligence activity directed against political activists, racial and religious minorities, and immigrants. In addition to infiltration and surveillance, establishment foundations control activists to make sure they don't pose a serious political threat to the status quo. Researcher Bob Feldman reveals how many organizations on the left are in the pocket of the Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Soros foundations. The Ford Foundation is a documented CIA front with connections to the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations, the same globalist organization that works with Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen at Google. Beyond its radical fringe, the left doesn't present a serious threat to the establishment. Groups like Code Pink often push the envelope, but their antics are allowed to give the impression there's active and serious opposition to the policies of the global elite. Code Pink is controlled opposition funded by the Benjamin Fund, Global Exchange, the New Priorities Foundation, the Streisand Foundation, the Threshold Foundation, and the Tides Foundation. Tides receives grants from the Chevron Texaco Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and George Soros's Open Society Institute, to name but a few. The overriding objective of Jigsaw is to dilute and preferably neutralize the ability of targeted political groups to utilize the internet as an information medium. The goal is to undermine alternative media which poses a threat to the establishment, the dominance of its institutions, and control of its propaganda media. Google has joined the NSA, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and its associated public-private organizations in a concerted effort to sanitize media of alternative voices. In the future envisioned by Eric Schmidt, corporations, the government, tech startups, and associated foundations will spell-check and censor politically incorrect media. Those of us on the outside may soon find ourselves permanently locked out of the internet, a medium that has allowed for the expression of alternative viewpoints and the dissemination of ideas considered a threat to the global elite.